Thanks everyone for joining us. Um, this is month 9. It's been great to do these, and I appreciate everyone that's been making it worthwhile to do it. And a lot of the feedback has been really great. So this may be the evolving format where we try to review a couple of crashes and mix in some of the scenario formats that we were using before. Um, and I'm going to dive into the normal stuff that I have here, which is, why are we doing this? Which is really just to share all of our experiences and make sure you're not the first probably ever experiencing something, and that there's just a huge need out there still. Um, Also, don't know if you guys know about FAA Safety Briefing magazine, but just plugging that, it's published every other month, and this month happens to have a great article on philanthropic flying. Uh, and I was lucky enough to get a lot of pictures in there. So, but I didn't pay anyone. So it's uh, it's a great magazine if you don't get it, and it's available online as well. So as you know, and I try to do this every time, make sure that everyone knows it can be any pilot, any plane can help. It really, there's no shortage of opportunities out there for anyone with anything that flies. And just to give you an idea of how many things I've flown for volunteers, it's a long list, and they've all worked out, and it's been a lot of fun. And I have friends that have flown, Cessna 152s into a Bravo airport. It's really just a blast how many things you can use to fly. Um, FAA host, I believe that Melanie went over this a second ago, so I won't spend too much time here. And panelists and advisors here. Melanie, as you know, is a senior air safety investigator, so great to have her on and her perspective. Carly is a regular and has a lot of experience and across the organizations. And Mary Kuhn helped me present last month and is going to be hopefully an ongoing advisor and a participant from time to time. So, as you also know, there's many, many different types of organizations out there, from medical care to education, STEM, discovery, human trafficking. Just, if you can think of it, there's probably a volunteer organization working on it. There's a list of all these organizations on the Air Care Alliance website, which you can easily look up. And there was a QR code, but it may be blocked from my little panel here. So, if you ever have questions about which type of organization to fly for, or questions about if you can fly, feel free to email me at any point after the meeting. Happy to respond. And I do get a regular flow of those, so very happy to help. Try to every month have a Did You Know section. And this month is on young eagles, which in 2024, flew a phenomenal number of children, 55,000. They're trying to hit the 2.5 million mark before AirVenture next year, and they're hopeful that they're going to get that. They say they have over 50,000 registered volunteer pilots, but as you can see, about 5,000 or so fly in any given year. Um, and again, they're an organization that uses any plane, any pilot. So it's a great way to get exposed to volunteering. And then the numbers I try to repeat and add to every month, the many, many ways that people can justify asking for a free flight to do something. Um, Given the recent federal changes in approach to medical care support, we're having a feeling that the number of people that miss cancer appointments, for example, in a given year because of transportation will actually increase, and that a lot of rural hospitals are on the chopping block as well. So that will increase the need for people living in rural areas to get access to medical care, which may require a trip of more than 100 miles, which is where most of the volunteer pilot organizations step in. So I will not spend too much time on this, but just jump on. And then we always know that working on your wings proficiency is good. Quick couple of QR codes. And if you have any questions about the wings program, please let any of us know after the fact. So this week or this month, we're really gonna focus on current proficient versus legal and personal minimums, and you'll see the reasons in a couple of seconds as we dive into the crashes. There's going to be 4 reviews. One's an IMC approach, one's an en route, another approach, and then a VFR, which is kind of an interesting one. So, one of the things I think that we don't spend enough time on in training or anywhere is what happens to you when you're having a stressful event while you're flying. Um, I, when I was a 150-hour pilot, I was doing a solo flight from Boston to Florida, which was my first major solo flight. And in moderate rain, I had an engine fire in a dual engine plane that I only had 50 hours in. So it was reasonably stressful and had to land at minimums in Atlantic City um, and a number of other things. And I can attest to the fact that tunnel vision is a real condition. And no one had gone over with me that, you'll lose focus the more stress you get. So if you do have any time to read into how stress affects your decision making in the air after this session, please, spend some time looking at that. Um, and training, and practice helps you offset this. But again, it's a deep topic and definitely worth diving into if you have the time. So we'll dive into the first mission. So this was a while ago, and some changes and practices happened as a result of this. Um, it was from Gabrowski, I believe, in Long Island to Boston, a relatively short flight. A husband and wife who had done many of these flights before. Um, Due to weight and balance, one of them was likely in the co-pilot seat, and it was an IMC day, and from New York, which was very, very busy airspace, into not equally but near as busy Boston airspace. Aircraft, Beech, G35 V-tail, capable airplane, not too many hours on it, but traditional six-pack navcom, and only a single axis autopilot, which may have been a contributing factor, but otherwise in good working condition. And the NTSB really didn't identify any faults with the panel. The panel is sort of like this, but we couldn't find confirmation of the exact configuration of the panel. Whether using four right is a very common runway at Boston Logan. And sometimes for angel flights or small, slower airplanes, they'll line us up on four right and have you do a quick turn to get into four left, just to stay out of the way of the fast movers. Um, so if you're not accustomed to doing this, you may be surprised. Or if you are accustomed to doing this, you're thinking ahead saying, okay, when are they going to tell me to make that little adjustment to land on a different runway? So the winds were favoring for ceilings were not too bad. 1100, 2000, 5500. Light rain never helps. Visibility 8 miles, but in light rain, that can be really variable, especially around the New England area. Um, but the temp dew points support the fact that we probably had some fog somewhere. Altimeter, not too bad. Pilot proficiency was not instrument current. That's just one issue we'll get into in a sec. Um, had only recently gone through angel flight orientation. And the orientation at that point, I had actually just started flying for angel flights in 2010. So the orientation was pretty minor. It was just confirming your currency and them offering to fly with you on a flight if you had any questions. So in this case, this pilot had two flights with a mentor before doing on their own, and had already done 11 flights. So the person was familiar with the Logan experience. So good amount of time. Um, and as you can see, not a lot of currency though. So people can get easily into a place where they look at the total number and don't look at currency. So only 2 hours in the last 30 days and 9 hours in the last 90 days. So the angel flight requirements at that point were an instrument rating with only 250 hours, which was only verified one time at sign up, and there was no currency, VFR, or instrument requirements in their pilot handbook. Their only requirement was that you were FAA legal. So there was no really ongoing review of currency and proficiency. So the crash unfortunately, three fatalities was before the final approach fix. The pilot missed the localizer twice, got a low altitude alert, and witnesses on the ground notified a plane coming out of the clouds spinning, and the track of the plane before entering that mode was a turns and a climb typical of spatial disorientation. So the crash was right around here. Here we are. So, and this is the normal approach. So right around here was beginning to lose it, uh, which is too bad. So the NTSB's probable cause on this, ob obvious based on the description, was, didn't maintain control. Um, and pretty clear once they inspected the logbooks that the pilot was not instrument current. And in fact, it had very little instrument time. It's kind of interesting, though, they did call out, and whenever you're flying into a Bravo, busy Bravo like Logan or something in New York, you're wondering who's in front of you and whether you're going to get the shake and bake treatment, which is a little bit of weak turbulence. Um, Usually, air traffic control is very, very good about keeping you separated, but it doesn't mean that something, some number of bumps won't still be lingering somewhere on your route. And I've had some pretty good ones where it should have been just perfectly calm, including a 60-degree almost rollover uh, behind an A320 where they probably had me a little too close. So so it can happen, but they don't have an easy way of measuring that. The pilot in this case didn't say anything, but they did look at it. And as a result of this, we started looking at ways to prevent this kind of accident from happening again. One of the things that they did change rather quickly is requiring the pilots to literally sign a written affirmation that they're current and proficient with all the policies and with the FAA guidelines. Um, and after that, uh, there was an FAA spatial disorientation manual put out. Um, but I don't think, and I have a presentation to the National Association of Flight Instructors later this month. And one of the things I want to point out is none of this really gets worked into your average training. And it's things that we really do need to start to address. And Carly, do you have any questions so far? Or doing well? So this
Doing
is
good.
sorry, good. Yeah. So this is the narrative, and I don't need to really read it all, but the highlight is pretty clear that the not volunteer pilot organizations were not really focused on asking about currency. And this really just sort of woke everybody up to say, it's not total hours that count. It's really measuring some type of currency. So pretty much all the organizations in the US after this crash started coming up and requiring the pilot to affirm, typically in writing back then because we didn't have all the iPad distribution out yet, um, that they were compliant. Didn't mean that it didn't still occur because last month you saw some crashes where they were after this, 10 years later and still having the same issue of people flying without being current. Um, but it became less of an issue and less of a concern. And again, they pointed out that the typical movements of a pilot getting disoriented were seen. Um, and again, the plane itself didn't have any obvious failures. So again, safety takeaways, currency and proficiency. How do we beat that into our everyday life? I know early on I was flying so much I didn't really think much about this, but then I went through a period where my daughter had been ill for about a year and I was not staying as current as I should. And but I also wasn't really doing missions, so I started really getting uh, more attentive, mostly after I had a sort of a bouncy landing saying, wait a minute, I used to just do these automatically. So um, always consider your obviously your proficiency before a flight and and the weather. And we'll get into the weather in the next crash. Um, and again, from the last month series of crash reviews, personal minimums, we can't stress that enough. A lot of the serious CSIP training now really drills setting personal minimums. Um, and we all probably need to go through that and not treat it casually. Um, and then when to have a co-pilot. So in this particular crash, there was a co-pilot, but it wasn't a pilot. It was a regular passenger that had flown a lot, and probably, was in a place where they knew they weren't comfortable making comments about what was going on, and whether the passenger could have been a distraction or not, who knows? But if they have a headset on, which they would likely have in this particular airplane, they would be hearing air traffic control notify the pilot that they missed turning on the localizer twice and asking if they needed help. So that's just probably increasing the stress on the pilot, not decreasing it or not helping. So, in this particular plane, you probably didn't have a choice again to have somebody sitting there for weight and balance. Uh, but got to decide whether that person's going to be distraction at any point during the flight and whether it's good to turn them off. Um, I learned early in my particular volunteer flying career that some people are just want to talk about everything and they'll ask questions at times when you want to have a sterile cockpit, even though you've reviewed that. So I've gotten to the point that when I'm in a plane with avionics that can do it, I'll tell people that I'm gonna not listen to them anymore, and turn them off. Not sure everyone wants to do that because it seems like you're not being polite, but it's something that you just have to figure out on your own and assess. And again, there's nothing in our training at any time that addresses this or addresses it well. So we really need to come up with our own ways to approach it. So if we don't have any questions, I'll go into one of the scenarios on this one. No, not on that one. So this one, I don't believe we reviewed this year. So I've had a tendency to do things that sometimes I wonder whether I should be doing. I had one day where I did four missions from Boston to New York to Ohio to Virginia to Pennsylvania and back. And by the end of that, I was exceptionally tired because about 80% of it was in IMC. So I said, whoops, I probably should never do that again. So um, about a year later, had done a volunteer pilot day with three low IFR, approaches, and two of the three legs had medical passengers. So wanted to make sure, everyone had a good flight, and I worked very hard to make sure that I'm safe and prepped, and I review airport issues and weather the day before. It's pretty much chair fly the flight the day before, so no surprises. But I also typically get last minute calls from uh, the volunteer pilot organizations that have a cancellation and a passenger stranded somewhere. Um, and this particular day, I had literally turned off the plane at my home base and got a call that someone was sitting in Providence. The pilot had had a mechanical and had to cancel at the last minute. And this particular passenger needed a pressurized airplane with steps, had heavy luggage, and was going home after a very, very long stay in Providence for treatment. So um, they weren't prepped to stay for another night. So, yeah, how much more pressure can you pile on? Um, so I said, well, I'm not super tired, but I could be. So I'm not going to do this flight unless I can find a co-pilot. So we waited until we could find, but told again the people that, we would do the flight, but I just couldn't tell them exactly when I would get to Providence. And Providence was only 40 miles from Norwood, Mass. And I'm not sure if you guys have done very short flights into a Charlie or Bravo airport, but that's actually the worst kind of flight because everything's happening very fast. Um, I did get I waited, for a co-pilot who I happened to know who was used to flying with me, even though didn't have a jet type rating. They were helpful and actually a flight instructor as well. Um, and you know, use the digital ATIS. I'm not sure if you guys know about using digital ATIS at very busy airports, but it's a lifesaver because you don't have to try to dial in ATIS and understand what's going on in the air. You can figure it out without leaving the ground. So got all the runways, set up the approach before I ever left Norwood. And even with all of that, I'd not landed in Providence in maybe 10 years, and I missed a turn on a taxiway, which turned out not to be, luckily, a major issue. Uh, but it just sort of beat into me that, your A game can go away pretty quickly on long duty days. Um, and my co-pilot didn't catch it either. So, we were both no excuses. So, yeah, having a co-pilot was a big deal. Luckily, the rest of the day went well. Um, but I also had one other fun thing happen. Not sure if you guys know that depending on the airplane, the pitot tube can stay very hot for a very long time. Some airplanes, it's on as long as the battery's on. And in my particular airplane, that's the case. So the pitot tube is hot up until the second you turn the plane off. Um, and in this case, an FBO guy who was putting chocks in the nose wheel, even though it says not to put chocks in the nose wheel, um, leaned into my pitot tube and melted his orange vest onto the top of my pitot tube. So then you're left with another question, which is, is this going to be a problem when I take off? Does it look clear? Do I scrape it off? Can it come off? So luckily, in this case, it had not gone in the front. I was able to sort of peel off enough that I knew the front of the pitot was not impacted, um, and and then did the rest of the day's missions without a problem. So so do better in this case. I not usually when I'm going to a new FBO, I'll send a note to the FBO saying, hey, this is how you deal with this type of airplane. Um, and in this case, I was in a rush and had not sent anything to that particular FBO. This person had the heaviest folded up wheelchair I'd ever seen. Um, and again, one of those things where if you talked to them the day before about their luggage and had time to interview them, it wouldn't have been a surprise, but it was a surprise. So the plane ended up being quite snug in terms of, where equipment was going and bags were going and things like that. Um, and I relied on my own efforts to find a co-pilot instead of enlisting the VPO because I thought I could find one right away. It took me a little while, so it did work out. But know that the most of the volunteer pilot organizations will go out of their way to help you when you've got one of these urgent one-off situations. Um, so again, using digital ATIS when you can before leaving and setting up before you leave is an obvious benefit if you can do it. Um, so interesting thing. In this particular case, this person's luggage would have precluded using most other light twins and even any single. So pre-flighting around luggage is one of those gotcha things that doesn't necessarily happen very often, but it catches you in the days that you don't do a good pre-flight interview. So don't know if you have any questions on this one. No, that's good. It's not good. Questions are fun, but yeah. So this will be relevant to the next crash, I think. And this is, again, on this particular day, managing the IFR condition or IMC conditions and the rain wasn't a big deal. I just happened to have a capable airplane with a very good autopilot, which helps me go into monitoring mode instead of flying mode rather quickly. Some others don't have that benefit. So crash number two, Angel Flight Northeast again, um, Bedford to upstate New York, which is Rome near Syracuse. Uh, Two passengers, they're returning home. They've done many, many flights. It didn't list how many, but it had been years. Um, no indication of whether either of them were sitting in the co-pilot seat, but in this kind of plane, the weight and balance would have allowed them to have both passengers in the back, and not have anybody sitting up front with the pilot. It was IMC. They were leaving later in the day and set to cruise at 8,000, and it was a very experienced Angel Flight pilot. So this is the route of flight from Boston to past Albany, New York, which is in the middle, uh, supposedly ending up in Rome, New York. Plane, very capable airplane, a Seneca, excuse me, counter-rotating prop, so it didn't have a critical engine. Anyone that's not used to twins, adverse yaw can be a very big problem to overcome. You do a lot of work to train around having or doing single engine work. And it helps if you don't have a critical engine, meaning one engine will force you more quickly to turn to roll over than the other. Um, so had recent inspections, and had flown a bit since the last inspection. So, you would hope there would be no surprises from maintenance causing any problems. Airframe relative to uh, this type of airplane didn't have that many hours on it. Did have an updated panel with a PFD, two-axis autopilot, um, and some weather capability, but it was early enough still in the NEXRAD days where, a lot of pilots may be still misusing NEXRAD and looking at it more as a real-time device instead of a 15 to 20 minute off device. Google tablet, and they didn't report whether this plane had radar, but most of the planes at that point had radar in them. Uh, didn't mean the pilots knew how to use the radar, which is another little issue all by itself. And I can say that I probably flew planes with radar for the first 10 years without really being super adept at using my radar. Pilot was, proficient, good training, good number of hours, and good number of hours and type. Um, did not, however, for some reason, report IFR currency in the analysis, and the medical was quite current as well. Angel flight requirements. I'm not sure if this is blocked because of where we have the tile and what you're seeing, but at that point, everyone was being required to sign that affirmation that you were current, but they didn't report whether they had actually received the signed affirmation in this particular case. So, um, don't know. It would have been an interesting point to see whether the pilot was treating it like a piece of paper or seriously treating it as something that they needed to confirm. Whether in Rome, New York, the pilot probably knew they were flying towards areas of moderate precipitation, and during the flight, ATC had notified the pilot of moderate, and heavy precipitation along the route of flight. Um, and there was an odd statement, and it indicated that he had the weather upload, and was aware of the precipitation. Um, so the weather upload back then, if he'd uploaded it to his iPad, it would be dated by that point. And even if it was NEXRAD, it would also be dated at that point. And uh, I can't tell you how many times, and I have the benefit of flying planes that fly really high as well as planes that fly down in the muck. And I can't tell you how many times I've looked out the window and said, there's a thunderstorm on my right. Um, that next red is still showing as on my left. So if I'd been using NextRad to avoid something, I would have been in the middle of some very unhappy weather. So um, again, not sure this pilot's training with his devices at that particular point. But will become clear in a second that there was a problem. So near the event Schenectady, which is where the little arrow is in the middle of the screen, was overcast and not particularly bad, but there's still moderate precipitation, and there was an air met for um, turbulence and ice, but the ice freezing level was indicated to be above 8,000. So, and the cloud deck was, or this top of clouds was over 18,000. So there's going to be no way to get above this in this kind of plane easily. And during uh, during all of this, the pilot tried to make some adjustments to get on, more directly onto the approach course, um, and did not successfully do that. So the pilot admitted turning the wrong way and then got into adjusting. And it's stated that there was a GPS configuration issue. So question was, what's happening when this happens? So the NTSB probable cause was spatial disorientation, loss of control, and that ice was not a factor, and whether they didn't call out whether they thought weather was actually a factor. Um, and what's unfortunate about this is, again, we have no way of knowing how familiar this pilot was with their avionics, nor when the avionics panel upgrade had occurred. And to me, that would have been an interesting thing to research, um, because we want to measure proficiency not only with time in the sky, but transition time. And I think we discussed this briefly in the last crash review in September. I usually look at going into a new airplane, and figure at least 50, but usually 100 hours before I'm super comfortable. And if I'm going into something where it's totally new avionics to me or somewhat new avionics to me, um, at least 25 to 50, for just getting to the point where it's muscle memory, where I'm not having to stop multitasking, which we're not supposed to say, but we all multitask, unfortunately, when we're flying. And just have time to fixate on fixing or working on something. So in this particular case, it's clear pilot something was going on. Something unexpected was going on. So the distraction value was there. Um, and no one was catching it. So this person didn't have a co-pilot to sort of monitor whether there was disorientation happening. Passengers were in the back, probably not hearing anything, so no interaction at all. So accident chain. So no co-pilot support. Um, Pre-flight weather plan, questionable whether there was much of a pre-flight weather plan other than one data upload, and we don't know when that data upload occurred. Um, Whether that pilot had had a lot of training and the available tools at that point, because this is in 2013. So we had a lot of pretty capable, easy to use tools at that point available to us. Um, we also don't know, again, the avionics and autopilot changes that were made in the panel, and how much time that person had, and why they weren't using more of the autopilot to do things. So probably preference would have been to have the autopilot doing more, but something was obviously going wrong. So the deduction here is that the pilot was hand flying and managing the changes. Um, and again, air traffic control was offering help with weather, and the pilot uh, went back and forth about whether to, you know, make adjustments to the course based on the advice and feedback that he was getting from air traffic control. Um, and again, the startle distraction value. So you can see in this case, again, sort of the same kind of flight characteristics that happen with spatial disorientation. Um, and you know, if you're focused on your avionics and you're in IMC, you're not necessarily getting physical feedback that this is happening to you until it's kind of late to react to it. So that's what it seems like was happening. So there was an in-flight breakup of going past max airspeed for this particular model. So fortunately for the NTSB in this particular case, there was two witnesses. Um, that were very, very close to where the accident was happening. And some of them, as you'll note here, were in a canoe and pieces of the airplane were falling around them. So we go back to this particular slide. This shows how long the debris field was. And the victims were not in the plane together, and they're all in this area here. So clearly, the plane, had a midair incident, um, and it's just hard to describe how that can happen. Um, so here's the narrative on it. Um, Albany also is reporting, um, you know, not not great cloud cover. So it's pretty low cloud cover, but there was a temperature inversion. So that could have also been contributing to some of the icing, or it could have had icing, but there was again no way to determine that. Um, and that there was wind and turbulence. So if you have an anomaly going on with your avionics, you're getting bounced around, um, and your hand flying, you have a recipe for some things to easily go wrong. Um, so the question is, could you have avoided all this by just doing a different weather analysis before you took off? So again, things that I was just pointing out, something was happening to distract the pilot, um, and whether this was a sudden need to manually fly versus using the autopilot, who knows? But it's highly suspect that that's what's happening here. So if there's no questions on this one, Carly,
No, Melanie and I have been sort of answering questions as we go along, but there's not one on this particular one.
cool. All right. Well, thank you for doing that. We'll keep plowing along here. We may actually get through all my content. We never get through all my content. So thank you for answering all the questions. So this one, I'm not sure if you guys remember this one, but this is actually has a good outcome, which is a really unexpectedly good outcome. So New Orleans to Wisconsin, two pilots, one passenger, and 56 dogs. Um, and they were all in crates, which were they're supposed to be. And that's one of the pilots and pause big issues that it's nice to take a cute puppy or cat out of their cage and hold them in the co-pilot seat, but really they're supposed to be in a cage. No distractions. Low IMC day, professional crew, they're all current. The plane is not new, but it's not old. It's a very, very well-known plane. Um, Weather was at minimums in Wisconsin. They were in the approach phase, and as they were approaching, they had a problem with the flight director and the autopilot doing things that were unexpected. So they decided to hand fly and had pretty much zero visibility. Um, so they intercepted the runway 10 localizer. And it was during that it started commanding unexpected turn. Um, so they disconnected the autopilot, manually flew the airplane, and it rolled severely to the right. And luckily, both pilots were able to overpower that, control the airplane. But by the time they overcame it, they hit the ground, but the wings were level. So luckily they maintained control. They did what you're supposed to do is get everything as level as possible and then keep working on your recovery. Um, and in this particular case, they were lucky they landed on a golf course. So there were not a lot of things to hit, but they did manage to hit enough that they ripped the wings off the airplane. So, but there was no fire. So this is an interesting situation where um, there's really they had really no way to determine what happened to the airplane, but the pilots flew the plane completely into the crash, um, and had leveled it so there was not a jolt. So there were no injuries. All the dogs walked away, all the people walked away. It's just one of those rare cases where everything sort of worked out. So again, this is the picture in the lower right of what it looked like on the golf course, after they had landed. So, there can be good outcomes on days where you have a very bad day, even with professional crew. So if there's nothing on this one that you guys aren't answering automatically, I'll dive into one of the next
One of
ones.
our one of our attendees is asking for you to elaborate on what an ice situation is.
What an icing situation is.
Mhm.
So if that's relative to the first one or the
I
second one or the third one.
I
So,
think they were just asking, was it an ice situation?
Was it in a nice situation?
oh,
Okay,
was it
yeah,
an
thanks.
icing? Yes, it was an icing situation, but they don't think it was caused by ice because these planes are certified for flight into known icing. And generally, if you have icing, it's a unilateral type of issue. It's not going to affect one side more than the other. In this case, it had a very steep roll to the right. So to me, we have servos that are controlling the plane as it's, going down the glide slope. And if those servos malfunction, that could cause, something that, an unexpected control event. Sorry, unexpected control event. Um, and most planes, um, especially complex planes like the one I fly, we have an override where you can push one button and it overrides. I'm sorry, I've got to figure out how to turn do not disturb on. But yeah, so we can override the autopilot and the servos and hand fly. So it looks like something was going on in this particular plane. The engine analysis, one of the other things that can cause a roll like this can be one of the engines is having an issue, particularly with uh, a turboprop or your propellers. If your propellers are not synced, you can have a severe yaw event to right or left. So if they had one engine that was having some issue either with the prop governor or with the engine itself, it could cause a pretty big yaw event like they were experiencing. Um, but again, the NTSB analysis didn't highlight any problems that they could find like that. But something caused it. And the black box in this particular airplane wasn't collecting enough data to let them do any deeper analysis. And that's pretty common. The black box in my plane catches a lot of parameters, but wouldn't catch a servo problem, for example. So, so again, doubtful that it was caused by ice. Elevator stalls are another things that can happen in ice, but again, that's not necessarily going to have you roll right or left. That's going to be more of a regular pitch issue. So hopefully that's answering the question. You can see there was a bunch of ice here, but they didn't have pictures right after the landing showing the wings. There was some speculation that it was an old plane and would have some kind of problems, but really in the NTSB report that wasn't listed as an issue. If you in the animal point of view, the crash got a lot of attention, so almost all the animals were adopted within a month. So one of the other net benefits of this particular event. So interesting thing. So life jackets. There was interesting. This is a scenario from one of our pilot participants in the webinar series. Um, So the experienced pilot flies a lot for Angel Flight West, and flying kids to cancer camps is a very big thing that Angel Flight West does. Um, and in this particular mission was coming from an area of Washington State, which is more like a desert, and flying to a part of Washington State, which is over the water. And because he's flying a small plane, a mall, he correctly thought to start asking his passengers to always have their life preservers on and before they take off. Um, but in this particular case, it was making the parents and the passengers in this case are flying without their parents. And that's one of the anomalies of flying kids to cancer camp is often they're unaccompanied. So that's adding even more pressure to the pilots. So in this case, the parents and the passengers were getting quite nervous. he was able to calm them down and eventually have an uneventful flight. So one thing that, in our email exchange on this particular scenario, it's pretty clear that a pre-flight call that's calling out that you're going to, ask someone to wear a life preserver or a life jacket, it would probably be good to do so you're not going through that at the airport just as you're about to take off. So again, the pre-flight call on volunteer flights is very important to try to do no matter what. Um, and he did well. I mean, this is a good practice and made me start thinking about whether I should have certain passengers in certain kinds of airplanes, wear their life jackets because I'd rather not be dealing with them asking questions about putting it on if I'm in a plane that's going to have to go into the water. Um, the other things that could have been considered are, what type of life jacket's appropriate for the size and age and type of passenger that you're flying. I've flown a lot of very young children, and it's occurred to me that my average life jacket's an adult life jacket. It's not set up for someone that weighs 30 pounds or 40 pounds. So, what am I doing, to have the right size life jacket? And how am I going to tell them if I'm using an adult one, how to adapt it to a child? Um, and then, life rafts and a go bag that floats. And so my early days of flying, I actually did have a life raft and I did have a go bag that floated. But then I got to the point where I wouldn't always bring it with me, and I probably should have. So the little things like that are things to go into the consideration list of do you add those to the type of gear that you maintain, and how do you make sure that they're appropriate to the kind of passengers that you're flying. But it was great to see this person thinking ahead and making sure that egress would be possible from his plane with passengers if they did have to go into the water. So a lot of fun. I'm sure everyone has variations on this and how they approach this. So. No questions on this one? So I'm not sure how many people just saw this event. It's a Cirrus that went into Lake Michigan. Very interesting event. I fly a Cirrus as a backup all the time. And I do fly it over Lake Michigan when I'm going to Oshkosh every year. Um, in this particular case, there was the SR-22 reasonably new, somewhat recently out of maintenance, but was not that recent out of maintenance. Was luckily doing VFR flight following, which is what you minimally should be doing if you're going over the lake. Um, and midway across the lake, had an engine failure. Um, wait tried to glide as far as they could and then pulled the chute because they knew they weren't going to make it to shore, and they were down probably around 1,500 feet. Um, and the plane successfully landed on the water, um, but sunk before rescue could happen. Um, and air traffic control, Johnny on the spot, and this one was very good, saw a local piston plane in the area, asked if they could help. And then on the left, you can see that pilot circled many, 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 many times, trying to, initially was able to keep the parachute in sight. You see, I don't have more on this. And he couldn't tell if the people had life preservers or life jackets. And then he could barely make up the people as well. And he counted only two, even though there was three souls on board. So they really didn't know what had happened to the third person based on this pilot's reporting. And in this case, the parachute was staying inflated and sort of dragging the plane along. And the plane ended up sinking before the rescue boats could get there. And originally they were forecasting it was going to be a 40-minute wait for the boats to get to this particular location. But after the plane sunk, um, the pilot and Mike Alpha that was circling could no longer see the people in the water. Um, and I did look at the TV footage on this. The people were wearing dark clothes and they had dark colored life preservers. They didn't have lights, they weren't yellow. Um, So not easy for spotting from the air. Um, so luckily for them, Lake Michigan is not in the winter, so they're not freezing to death. The water temperature is around 60, 55 to 60. So hypothermia is not going to be as much an issue. But being in the water for 40 minutes in the middle of Lake Michigan is probably not something you want to do. Um, they did not have a life raft, something that I thought most people crossing the lake should have, though I've done it without one. So, so I can see what their thinking would be that maybe it's okay. And they luckily, again, a sheriff boat and then the Coast Guard got there in about 20 minutes instead of 40 minutes. So they were successfully rescued. But again, there was no plane anymore, and the parachute got pulled down under the waves by the sinking airplane. So they didn't have that big yellow orange thing to aim for. So good outcome, but what would you really do, for yourself not to get caught in this situation? So I'm going to give you an example here. So I'm not sure if you can see all this. Here you go. So this is a common route for volunteer pilot organizations in the East. So some from upstate Maine to some airport like Boston Logan or one of the other airports around Boston Logan. Um, and I the planes that I've used for this are on the left, an SR-22, a Piper Meridian, and the Eclipse. So air traffic control normally would take you to north of Boston and then punish you by making you fly at 3,000 feet at, 150 knots around Boston Logan, which can be very bouncy for your passengers and eats up a lot of fuel. And, is something generally that you don't want to do. Um, and then sometimes they'll offer you this shortcut, which is go directly to the tip of Cape Cod, and then make a right-hand turn and you're at home base. So the question is, how if you're an SR-22, are you going to take that route and save a bunch of time and be out that far over the water? Um, are you going to do it if you're in a Meridian, which is still a single engine airplane, but a turboprop at least, or are you going to think twice about it and doing it in a twin engine plane of some sort? So um, I did it a couple of times very early in my flying career in a SR-22 G3, thinking that it was in my invincible period of being a new pilot and thinking that I could do anything without necessarily thinking that um, what the outcomes would be if I did have an engine failure fairly out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which is never warm. I grew up in Maine. The water is never warm. You go into the ocean by waiting for your legs to get numb, and then you go the rest of the way. So, hypothermia is a real thing. So once that started happening, I had a pretty good go bag. But then I would get caught every now and then not having that with me. So I stopped doing it in the SR-22 and I started flying the Meridian. I said, oh, I've got a Pratt& Whitney. They never fail, but it's still a single engine plane and I'm in the middle of the ocean. So is that really a good idea? So I got to the point where I just left everything in the airplane all the time. So I could have the option of taking the shorter route. Uh, And the bottom right here is a route from Eastport, Maine, which is on the Canadian border, which puts you even further into the middle of the Atlantic. And if you're using your mapping system, in my particular plane, it's off the map. So it's sort of not even showing where you are in the Atlantic Ocean. It's just a segment of blue. So, um, so again, is that good practice? So doing it in the Meridian, I got to the point where I stopped doing that in the Meridian, and if I was in the twin engine airplane, I would do the out into the middle of the ocean thing, just because the likelihood of with twin turbines of both of them failing is extremely low. So But just curious what you guys would think about what you would make your standard practice, avoid the water or, take the shortcut and it's okay as long as you bring a lot of stuff. But even if you bring a lot of stuff, if you're wearing life jackets, you're going to freeze to death. It's not the Atlantic Ocean, it's not forgiving, and Lake Michigan in the summer is barely forgiving. So, yeah, interesting thing. Again, so not sure if you guys have any questions on that one. If not, I'll go to another one.
No, you're all good, Mark. Keep going.
Cool, thanks. This is one I'm not sure that, again, we do over in training ever, and we probably need to add it somewhere in some syllabus. Not sure if you've done cross countries or any volunteer flights into the middle of nowhere. Um, but if you do, I'm not sure what your preparation is to do that. Um, and you can get a good startle distraction response, and you can make some poor decisions, you know, if you don't have all the information. So in this particular scenario, we're had two sets of passengers on one plane. It was winter. Uh, Went to the nearest airport first, drop off some people, continued on to the second airport. Um, and these were going to far north. So if anything, it was getting colder and more snowy. This is me. I was familiar with both airports, but I had not been at the first airport a very, very long time. Um, and because it was in the middle of nowhere in the middle of Maine, you get pretty good routing straight in. You don't have to do a lot of vectoring to get into the approach. And as soon as I touched down, the plane was being launched into the air by potholes and frost heaves, and it was going in all directions. The plane was vibrating. There was vegetation in the cracks. It was not an expected, typical airport landing. Um, and, I did like braking. I didn't want to overreact, not knowing what else was coming on the runway, but um, it was too late to sort of not land. Um, and when I departed, I had to make a decision whether to depart because I wanted to get out of there and get the missions done. So I figured I would do a short field departure. Whoops. So what had not occurred to me is what were all my possible data sources for runway condition? Because usually I was just going to ForeFlight looking to see what the comments were about the airport. Um, and sometimes not always, but sometimes I would look in either the forums or in AirNav. And I was rarely checking AOPA. And AOPA has a very good website, which we'll go over in a second. Um, so in this particular case, ForeFlight had no comments. There was nothing there at all. And the other applications really didn't show anything that would have been kept me from uh, going there or having the surprise. Um, and we'll get into what the solution here is in a second. But what I did do afterwards is I checked everything because it was so violent. I was wondering whether I would have a tire problem or struts or something. It was broken, but luckily nothing looked broken, and taxiing was fine. And I did come up with a strategy to go down the runway slowly and look for a pathway that would be less bumpy, and then I was commit to doing a short field takeoff just to avoid as many bumps as I could, which did work. And nothing fell off the airplane after that, which was also good. So, all right. Carly, you're talking to me?
Nope. No, you're
Good.
all good, Mark.
All right, that's fine. Um, so, so it did turn out that AOPA has written a bunch about runway condition, which is very good. Um, but it, but they're pointing out a very good thing is it's like a PIREP. You just don't know who wrote it and what their credibility is in writing it. So whatever you find may not be actually what you get when you land there. Um, so let's go on to the next one. So there is a runway condition FAA process. Again, it still can be somewhat subjective, and that's what this is going over here. And if you go into the AOPA system, which I was not always doing, I used to do it more diligently, and it's another long story as to why. But more recently, I've been using my iPad and other sources to determine the condition of the airport. So in this case, if you went to AOPA, um, they had very good data about what this airport's runway conditions were. And that may have made me think twice. In a lot of cases, the passengers don't have to go to a particular airport. They can drive an hour to another airport, local airport, um, and it's still better than driving 8 hours to get into medical care. So during our evaluation process, we should probably be spending a lot more time looking at runway condition because it just takes one bad pothole or one bad frost heave to make you have not a good day, regardless of your kind of airplane. So very much recommend looking at the AOPA Destinations website, or you can just do Google searches with your airport identifier and AOPA, and usually it will bring it up. But it's definitely something worth adding to your pre-flight planning. This little QR code will take you there as well. And I'm actually at the end of my presentation on time. This is unbelievable. So thank you, everyone. It's always fun to do these. How are we doing, Carly or Melanie? Are we?
Great. You got through all of the content, which is amazing. And
Yeah.
we've answered some great questions. Thanks for everybody who submitted them. Hopefully we were able to get to all of your questions. And great job, Mark.
A lot of fun to do these. I appreciate everybody, and please keep your emails coming with suggestions for scenario reviews or topic reviews. And I think we're going to stick with this format where we'll do at least 2 crash reviews per month, and then we'll sprinkle in some scenario reviews as well.
Yeah.
Go
It
from
was
there.
great,
So
Mark.
enjoy your
Thank
evening. Again, thanks so much. And oh, last thing, if the government is shut down in November, that means there'll be no webinar. And similarly, if it's still shut down in December, there'll be no webinar. So whenever the government comes back, we'll come back. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, much thanks, Mark.